Chapter 22, of Men and Monsters. Celestia stared at the creatures before her with an unflinching but curious gaze. Never, in her nearly 2 centuries of life, had she seen anything like them. They stood on 2 legs, much like minotaurs, yet they had neither fur, horns, nor tail of any kind. On first sighting them as they approached the outskirts of Bridledown, Celestia had thought they were some kind of unholy patchwork monsters of bone and sewn flesh. Till a closer look revealed it was merely an illusion created by the grotesque armor they wore. Beneath that armor, the creatures seemed almost universally past their prime, their bodies scar-covered, and weathered by age and hardship. They brought with them a stench like rotting meat, sulfur, and freshly spilled blood, and nearly all were armed with weapons made of what appeared to be bone. Behind Celestia, the citizens of Bridledown huddled in terror of their new visitors. Honestly, she really couldn't blame them. These creatures would have terrified her too, had it not been for a singular oddity in the creatures' wide and staring eyes. It was said that eyes were the window to the soul, a portal through which one might see the true nature of another being's self. In the eyes of these creatures, for all their outward ferocity, Celestia could not see even the slightest hint of malice. Rather, the thing she saw most prominently in the eyes of these strange bipeds was confusion and pain. Unimaginable, unspeakable, soul-shattering pain. Even as they stared in awe and confusion at Bridledown and its inhabitants, the pain and sadness surrounding these creatures was like a miasma, that no one who could detect it could possibly ignore. However, there was one among their number, whose eyes matched his terrible appearance perfectly. He stood slightly over 6 feet tall, a bit taller than even Celestia herself. His body beneath his armor seemed so covered in old injuries, that it was a struggle to tell where his scars ended, and his skin began. Every limb was lean and muscled, without so much as a trace of fat, the veins standing out beneath skin that seemed almost to glow, with a faint charnel radiance. Underneath a bone helmet that obscured his entire face, were a pair of burning red eyes, that glared into Celestia's own violet set, with a look of undisguised contempt. Finally, in one hand, he held a sword of black steel, decorated with faintly glowing golden runes. He held the sword lowered at his side, the blade oriented so that the tip was pointed toward the ground but stayed ready for use, a clear warning to any who might strike at him. Based on the deference the others seemed to show him, and the aura of brutal power he exuded, Celestia could only assume this scarlet-eyed warrior to be the massive group's leader. The creatures and their leader had arrived abruptly and without warning. As Celestia, her sister and co-ruler Luna, and the citizens of Bridledown, had been preparing for the first summer feast. A massive celebration that was part summer festival, and part founding day party for the town. Tents, stalls, and hundreds of tables and benches, were set up at the edge of town. In anticipation of a carefree night of eating, drinking, dancing, and singing. Their strange visitors had appeared as they had been setting up the final few tables, and getting the last of the food ready. Celestia herself had been examining a scrumptious-looking honey cream cake for the 3rd time that day, claiming it was for quality control. An assertion neither Luna, nor any pony else, had believed for an instant, when the ground had begun to lightly shake. Then, with a cry of alarm, some pony had directed all of their attention to the top of a large hill overlooking the town and the castle behind it. There the creatures had appeared. Numbering in their thousands, they had paused briefly atop the hill, seemingly to examine the town from a distance, before marching as one to the site of the party preparations. Moving in perfect lockstep march, the earth shook faintly in time with their steps as they advanced, not stopping until they were directly in front of Celestia. At her side, she could tell her sister was struggling to stay calm, while the citizens of Bridledown huddled behind their leaders in terror of the fearsome new arrivals. Celestia, however, simply smiled at the strange creatures. As, for all their intimidating appearance, and for all the ferocity their leader seemed to project, she felt, deep in her soul, that these beings had not come intending to start trouble. So, Celestia smiled, and greeted them as her heart told her she should. "Greetings, travelers, thou look weary. Pray, rest thine hooves, and help thyself to whatever food or drink thou might desire." Speak to us thy story, that we might call thee friend." The effect was as swift as it was dramatic, with every one of the strange creatures able to see her, staring at Celestia with a goggle-eyed expression. Only their leader seemed unimpressed, as he spoke in a voice that put Celestia in mind of a great beast growling at its prey. "So, you can speak." The Doom Slayer glared down at the creature before him with a sense of faint disbelief, though he was careful not to allow it to show on his face. Behind him, he heard the men of the Legion whispering to one another in confusion, and for the first time in a long time, the Doom Slayer could understand their feelings. However, this feeling of understanding was almost entirely eclipsed by a sense of burning anger, as he considered the events of the last few hours. After awaking to find themselves in this strange new location, and after shaking off the effects of its almost mind-numbing beauty, the Legion had swiftly moved to secure the area. The Doom Slayer had immediately demanded a full account of events from the sentries set the night before, and had nearly killed them when they had explained what had happened. To a man, every one of them had fallen asleep at their post, claiming to have been lulled to sleep by the sweet scent of the miraculous flower they had found. The Doom Slayer had been livid, and only the intervention of Michael had kept him from ordering, and swiftly carrying out, the men's execution. In any army, falling asleep on guard was tantamount to treason, and the Legion was no exception. However, Michael had argued that given the extraordinary circumstances, it would be best not to throw away the lives of soldiers they may soon need. The Doom Slayer had agreed, but only just. Immediately afterward, the Doom Slayer had sent members of the Dragon and Ghost Guards to scout in every direction for a few miles, and report what they found. The first report had come almost immediately, with one of the scout teams describing a large village positioned in front of a massive stone castle, situated about 2 miles to the east. That, however, was where the scouts' report took a turn for the incredulous, to the point that the Doom Slayer had almost accused the 5-man unit of having lost their collective minds. They had reported that the town was entirely inhabited by small, brightly colored horses, with not a single human in sight. That in and of itself would have been enough to warrant an immediate accusation of insanity, but the report was far from done. The scouts further declared, that many of the equine creatures had been seen wearing clothing, and appeared divided into 3 subgroups. The first was simply a standard horse, or more likely pony, given their reported smaller stature. While the others displayed the very distinctive traits of the mythological Pegasi and unicorns. The Doom Slayer and Michael had stared, in blank-faced disbelief, as the scouts had then concluded by claiming that these strange creatures had been overheard to be speaking a language nearly identical to the common tongue of Dnua. The scouts had sworn upon their oath to the truth of the report, not a thing done lightly, as in the Legion, nothing was more sacred than a warrior's word of honor. Thus giving the Doom Slayer and Michael little choice but to believe the scouts' fever dream esco tale. They had set out the instant the remaining scouting parties had returned. The Doom Slayer declaring that they would march on the village and castle with all haste. They went in fully kitted out, and prepared for a fight. But the Doom Slayer, at Michael's advisement, gave strict orders that battle was not to be joined under any circumstances, unless he specifically ordered it. The trip was short, following a winding dirt road that the scouts had said led right into the village. As they marched, the Doom Slayer caught snippets of his brother's conversations, and it disconcerted him that many seemed to be whispering, among other things, words like heaven or afterlife, with an uncomfortable frequency. The Doom Slayer, however, held no such delusions. This was no afterlife, they were all very much still breathing, and as far as he was concerned, this whole setting stank of demonic trickery. It would not have been the first time. Over their years of battles in hell, all manner of weapons and tactics had been brought to bear against the Legion. Most were uncomplicated attempts to simply overpower them, but nearly just as many had been far more subtle. The illusionary paradise was not a new trick, the demons had tried it before, and it had even been moderately successful. A similar trap having killed several dozen of the Doom Slayer's brothers some 20 years back. However, with every wound the demons inflicted, the Legion had grown stronger. The Doom Slayer himself had trained exhaustively with the commanders and lieutenants of every one of the guards, learning the combat tactics and philosophies of each, and mastering their various martial styles. Only having made an exception for magical combat, as he was never particularly good with magic. Besides, he preferred the power of his sword arm to anything else. Swords, guns, and fists, in his opinion, were more reliable than magic that could be dispelled, restricted, or even taken away entirely, given the proper technique. Though he did learn a few minor tricks that he felt could be useful in a pinch. The Legion had similarly evolved, learning the secrets of defeating everything from storms of hellfire and fountains of acid, to attempts at mental control. Eventually it got to the point where the minds and bodies of the Doom Legion had become veritable fortresses. Over the years, nearly all weakness had been culled from them, until only the most powerful remained to carry on the fight. However, as the Doom Slayer listened to his brother's absurd talk of paradise, he began to consider that perhaps the call had not been severe enough. They had arrived at the edge of the town without announcement or fanfare. Following in the wake of their commander, the Legion had marched straight up to the being the Doom Slayer had pegged as most likely to be the leader of these strange creatures. She, for her long lashes and oddly feminine appearance left little doubt of her gender, was markedly taller than her fellows. She had a pure white coat, that seemed as soft and delicate as the finest silk. Her hair, or rather, mane, was an exquisitely beautiful prismatic arrangement of all the colors that accompanied a sunrise, and that danced in an unseen ethereal breeze. Her violet eyes were filled with kindness and wisdom, as well as a touch of playfulness, hinting at a sense of humor hidden from all but the most observant eyes. On both of her flanks, the Doom Slayer noted an image of a sun. What it symbolized he could hardly guess, but so detailed was the image, he could only assume it had been applied by magic. Her tail, like her mane, also wafted in an unseen and unfelt breeze of no doubt mystical origin. Around her neck she wore an adornment the Doom Slayer seemed to recall was called a patrol, made of gold, and decorated on the front with a flawless amethyst gem. Her hooves were encased in decorative golden horseshoes, that extended over her shins in an aesthetically pleasing fleur-de-lis shape. Finally, and to the surprise of even the Doom Slayer, she had not only wings, but a proud spiral horn extending from her forehead. Above which, was perched a golden crown, decorated with extremely fine scrollwork, and another perfectly cut purple gem. This creature had an undeniable presence. Matronly wisdom, poise, and kindness seemed to radiate from her like the light of a star. She seemed to project a calming aura of peace and understanding, that made her seem powerful without it being obvious why. The Doom Slayer, however, acknowledged none of this. In the Legion, one was not given respect or authority, such things had to be earned through deeds. This thing was clearly regarded as some form of royalty, no doubt it would expect the Doom Slayer to bow his head and offer a humble greeting. If so, then it was in for a rude awakening. However, its first words were so unexpected they caught the Doom Slayer completely and wholly off guard, something that had not happened in decades. "Greetings, travelers, thou look weary. Pray, rest thine hooves, and help thyself to whatever food or drink thou might desire. Speak to us thy story, that we might call thee friend." Her voice was every bit as beautiful and noble as her appearance. Though this fact was lost on the Doom Slayer, as he painstakingly searched her face and words for even the faintest hint of deception. Over many years, the Doom Slayer had developed an almost preternatural ability to discern when someone was lying. With a single look into a man's eyes, he would instantly see through even the most elaborate of deceptions. So it was with some degree of shock, that the Doom Slayer was unable to find even the slightest hint of dishonesty in the eyes of this strange being. The offer this creature had just made, an offer of generosity and friendship, to a literal army of heavily armed aliens, clad in the skins of monsters, was entirely genuine. Finally, the Doom Slayer, his eyes never leaving this odd creature's own gaze, spoke. "So, you can speak." The two stood staring at each other for some time, the monstrous-looking Doom Slayer, and the regal-looking pony. One glaring in suspicion, the other smiling in welcome. The two regarding each other from across vastly different perspectives and ideals. Finally, however, Celestia spoke again with a faint giggle. As can thou. Is this truly so surprising? The Doomslayer's frown deepened beneath his helmet. Where we come from, horses can't talk, he declared, suspicion staining his every word. Horses? Came a slightly indignant voice from next to the white equine the Doomslayer currently faced. Thou malignous good stallion. We art ponies thank thee very much. Glancing down, the Doomslayer was confronted with a second winged unicorn, glaring up at him with an annoyed expression. Slightly shorter than the one the Doomslayer had been talking to, she was both incredibly similar, and drastically different. Her whole appearance was like looking at a living statue, created in loving dedication to the beauty of the night sky. Her mane and tail in particular reinforced that idea. As they were like a living midnight blue mist, inside of which countless twinkling motes of light were suspended. Like her taller counterpart, her mane and tail moved of their own accord, gently rippling and coiling like they possessed a will of their own. She had a dark blue coat that made one think of the sky just before the stars come out. Save for a splash of pure black on her flank, upon which was superimposed a mark in the shape of a pearlescent, white crescent moon. Additionally, she too wore a set of royal accessories, their appearance almost identical to those worn by the pony that had first spoken to the Doomslayer. Her hooves were each covered with a strange shoe, made of a metal that almost perfectly mimicked the color and effect of her mane and tail. While around her neck was another petrel, this one of a midnight black metal, that almost seemed like solidified darkness, with a crescent of faintly glowing white stone set in the center. Finally, perched atop her head, was a crown of the same material as the armored circlet that encased her neck. And you are? The Doomslayer demanded, almost impressed when the night-themed pony didn't flinch away from his angry glare. Thou ought introduce thyself, before demanding the name of another. She replied with a slight huff. The Doomslayer let out a growl, causing the pony to wince, though she still refused to break eye contact. The last guy that demanded my name like that, ended up screaming in a pool of his own blood before he heard it. The Doomslayer stated slowly, pausing just long enough to make the creature before him nervous, before continuing. But all right, call me, the Doomslayer. The shorter of the two apparent royals, gave the Doomslayer a curious look. Doomslayer? She asked, speaking the words as though testing out how they sounded. Is that not a title rather than a name? She asked haughtily. It's the only name you're gonna get. Now tell me who and what the fuck you two are before I lose my patience. The Doomslayer snarled. For a moment, the dark blue pony thing looked like it was about to say something nasty, but was stopped from speaking by the larger white one stepping forward slightly. Our name is Princess Celestia, and this is our sister and fellow monarch, Princess Luna. It is our pleasure to welcome thee and thine fellows to Equestria, and the capital city of Bridledown. Please, won't thou join us for the first summer feast? The Doomslayer glared at the one calling itself Celestia. He'd had just about all he could take of this place, and an invitation to sit around and endure more of it, was sounding increasingly like an insult to his ears. Opening his mouth to tell Celestia in no uncertain terms what she could do with her invitation, the Doomslayer suddenly found himself interrupted by the voice of Michael Sanchez. A most gracious invitation to be sure, your majesties, however I do not think it possible for you to accommodate all 10,000 of us. Darren turned to glare at his second in command. What in the almighty fuck, was the point in being polite to a gaggle of what in all likelihood were demonic illusions? However, Michael ignored his lord's silent anger, sweeping past him to introduce himself with an elegant bow. The Doomslayer knew Michael well enough to assume he wouldn't interrupt his master unless he felt it important, but it was a struggle not to simply shove him aside and tell the strange creatures to screw off. As it was, the Doomslayer decided to wait, and see what happened, as Michael played diplomat. Michael Sanchez, Lieutenant and aide-de-camp to the Doomslayer, Lord and High Commander of the Doom Legion, humbly at your service. The Doomslayer felt a flare of pure rage as his second-in-command kowtowed to a pair of over-touted farm animals, but managed to hold his tongue. At last, a pony that doth possess manners. Luna remarked under her breath, glaring briefly over Michael's shoulder at the Doomslayer. Celestia chuckled as she returned Michael's bow. "A pleasure to make thy acquaintance, Michael Sanchez. However, pray not to worry, accommodating thou and thine friends is but the work of a moment." Here Celestia's horn began to glow with a beautiful golden light, as soft and comforting as the sun on a spring day. Then, before the Doom Slayer could do more than tighten his grip on his still drawn sword, there was a brilliant flash of light, and the Legion gave a collective gasp. In their midst, had appeared hundreds of tables, each laden with some of the most delicious-looking food any of them had ever seen. Mouth-watering soups, accompanied by fresh-baked bread, salads that looked like the ingredients had been picked scant minutes ago, paellas and quiches that smelled as divine as if the light itself had made them. There were pasta and rice dishes, curries and stir-fries, all of which looked so good as to put any restaurant on Nua to shame. Desserts of every description were also present. Pies and flans, cookies and crumbles, tarts and tiramisu, puddings, custards, and cakes of every design, flavor, and description imaginable. All this seemingly endless bounty, created in the space of an instant, by a single being. "Dost thou think it enough, or shall we make more?" Celestia asked with a smile. However, before his second in command could answer, the Doom Slayer's voice roared out. "The first man to touch so much as a single grape gets his head taken off." As the Doom Slayer's command echoed out in all directions, Celestia stared at him in confusion. "Prithee tell us, good Doom Slayer, is something the matter? Is the food not to thine liking?" she asked, clearly unsure why he would give such an order. In response, the Doom Slayer rounded on her, glaring with eyes filled with hate. "Drop the act, demon, you aren't fooling anybody," he snarled. "No mage can just materialize food and objects out of thin air at the drop of a hat. Something like that takes preparation, and a substantial amount of mystical power. Even in the Legion there are only a dozen or so mages who could even attempt to pull that off without at least drawing a focusing circle." Here the Doom Slayer leveled his sword at Celestia. "That means you're either a mage so powerful and skilled you could put Armin himself to shame, or this is all some kind of elaborate illusion," he declared, a near psychotic rage in every word as he raised his sword. "What art thou?" Celestia cried out in shock. "Sister," Luna shouted. "My lord, wait," Michael cried out as his master shoved him aside. Bringing his sword down in a glittering arc, intent on striking Celestia's head from her shoulders. The Doom Slayer grinned savagely beneath his helmet, as another of Hell's minions fell. Or at least, that was what was supposed to happen. A soft metallic tone, like a wind chime gently striking a piece of wood, echoed in the ears of ponies and Legion alike, as they stared in shock at an impossibility. The sword had struck Celestia, a perfect hit in fact, right where her head and neck met. However, rather than removing her head in a spray of blood, the sword simply stopped dead the instant it made contact with her flesh. To Celestia, it felt as if the Doom Slayer had merely gently rested a thin piece of metal against her neck. It was as though the blade's momentum had inexplicably vanished, leaving her without so much as a bruise. Every creature present, human and pony alike, stared at the scene in utter shock. However, none were more confused than the Doom Slayer. He was certain he put his full strength into that blow, so why wasn't the demon dead? It couldn't have been magic. Unmaker devoured corrupt magic every bit as readily as evil souls. Nor could it have been armor, as no armor in the universe could block a hellbane, so what had happened? "The flesh of the innocent," Michael whispered, his eyes wide as he stared at the scene before him. It was at that moment that Luna recovered, turning on the Doom Slayer with an enraged expression. "What in yon buck dost thou think thee are doing?" she roared, magically amplifying her voice to a degree that made even the Legion wince. "Hast thou taken complete leave of thy senses?" she demanded. I don't understand." The Doom Slayer whispered to himself, oblivious to Luna's fury. This can't be real." It was at that moment, just when the ponies were starting to cast looks of anger at their guests, that Celestia started laughing. "Verily doth thou have an interesting sense of humor, Doom Slayer," she declared between giggles. We dare say thou had us quite convinced that thou were actually trying to kill us. Such magnificent acting, hast thou taken any formal lessons? She asked with a chuckle. The Doomed Slayer stared blankly at Celestia for a moment, withdrawing his sword as he tried to understand how she could have possibly thought his attack had been a joke. However, Michael was a bit quicker on the uptake, as he joined in laughing. "Ah yes, my lord's famous prankster nature," he declared, placing his hand on the Doomed Slayer's shoulder in a familiar manner as he smiled. "Please forgive us for not warning you, Princess," he stated with a chuckle, that only those who knew him, would have realized was forced. Finally it clicked in the Doomed Slayer's head what the Princess and his lieutenant were attempting to do. He could have played along, passed it all off as a big joke. But that was not how he did things. Jerking his shoulder out from under Michael's hand, the Doomed Slayer glared into Celestia's eyes, his voice a low threatening growl. "I don't know how you survived that, and I don't know what kind of trickery this is, but we are done here," he declared, before motioning to his brothers. "Back to camp," he roared, as he turned his back on the town, the ponies, and the princesses. "Wow. Darren was kind of a jerk back then," commented Rainbow Dash, as the images within the soul projection spell dissolved into mist in preparation for the next memory. "Well, ain't that the understatement of the century?" Applejack deadpanned, giving Rainbow a slightly condescending look. Shining Armor meanwhile, looked at Darren sitting, and currently in sensate form, in stark disbelief. "That's how you three first met?" he demanded, his eyes flicking between Darren, Celestia, and Luna. "Darren showed up and tried to kill you." Celestia gave Shining Armor a slightly sad look. "I know how this must look, Shining Armor. However, I can say with absolute certainty, that Darren Grandel has never once tried to harm me, or my sister." Shining stared at her with his mouth hanging open, incredulous at that statement. "What in Equestria are you talking about? We all literally just saw it," he declared angrily. "Darren Grandel tried to murder you." "That wasn't Darren," Twilight said softly. Rounding on his sister, Shining opened his mouth to reply, only to be forestalled by an upraised hoof. Darren would never lash out like that unless there was a direct threat to him. Even when he killed that poor man before, he didn't strike until the man had a gun pointed at him. Even at his worst, I've never once seen Darren directly attack any pony who he didn't honestly believe was threatening him, or some pony else, Twilight stated calmly. "Wait. So then, that stallion is..." Shining trailed off, as Celestia nodded. "Darren's other aspect, the one called the Doomed Slayer. Although, even that is not entirely accurate." Shining arched an eyebrow at that. "What do you mean?" he asked, even as a voice in the back of his head assured him he wasn't going to like the answer. Celestia suddenly looked slightly grim. "Keep watching, you will see soon enough," she replied, as the misty window into Darren's ancient memories swirled, to reveal the next part of the story. It had been several hours since the legions returned to camp, and the Doomed Slayer was in a foul mood. The instant he had gotten back, he had ordered the Elder Guard to use every divination and scrying spell they knew, to find a way out of this insanity. However, no matter what spell or incantation they tried, the answer was always the same, that this was no illusion, and wherever they were, it was not even remotely close to hell. This news could hardly have been less welcome to the Doomed Slayer. He didn't know exactly why, but he hated it here. Everything about this place seemed to make him angry, from the warm sunlight beaming down outside his tent, to the grass beneath his feet. It wasn't a feeling of danger, at least, not that he could discern. Nevertheless, he couldn't shake his feelings of tense restlessness. His skin itched like crazy, and there was a burning feeling in his gut, that only seemed to go away when he ate the last of the imp jerky he had. Staring at his hand, the Doomed Slayer kept slowly clenching and unclenching his fist. A hitherto unknown tic he seemed to have developed, that made it seem as if he was flexing invisible claws. Glancing outside, the Doomed Slayer felt a flare of white-hot fury, as he saw his brothers lounging in the sun. It had been less than 6 hours and already they were going soft. Some napped in the warm daylight, while others talked animatedly about this place they found themselves in. What was it called? Equestria? The Doomslayer snorted, fighting against the urge to go outside, and beat every one of his brothers to a bloody pulp. Then he heard something that made him jump to his feet in a near berserk fury. A snippet of conversation from two of his brothers passing outside his tent. "So bad if we were stuck here. It would be nice to at least live the last years of my life in comfort." The Doomslayer, seeing red, moved toward the tent flap, intent on making a bloody example of the traitor who would so casually abandon the Legion's mission. However, just as he exited the tent, the Doomslayer was intercepted by Michael Sanchez. "My lord, are you all right?" he asked, noticing the look of pure wrath in his lord's eyes. Michael's question seemed to snap the Doomslayer out of his rage, as he stopped looking around him, and turned to his second in command with the fire in his eyes slightly doused. "It's nothing," he said after a brief pause. "What do you want?" Michael nodded and cleared his throat as he explained. "It is the princesses, my lord. They are at the edge of the camp and requesting to speak to you." The Doomslayer scoffed. It was almost enough to make him laugh. "And what in the hell could they possibly want? I thought I told them we're done." Michael nodded. "Indeed, my lord, but considering they are the rightful rulers of this land, it would perhaps be politic to grant them an audience." The Doomslayer growled in annoyance. "What are they gonna do? Throw cupcakes at us till we leave? If they try to get fresh with us, I'll just break their legs and leave them to rot in the woods," he hissed venomously. Michael nodded as if considering the possibility. "Even so, my lord, they do seem to have a surprising level of mystical power, and it is of a variety that even Lord Common is at a loss to fully identify. So, if only to err on the side of caution, perhaps we could play along, so to speak." The Doomslayer considered his lieutenant's words for a moment, before responding. "Fine," he snarled, clearly unhappy. "I'll go meet with the queens of the nags, or whatever the hell they are, but only so I can tell them to fuck off." Michael nodded diplomatically, hopefully he could convince his lord to be a bit more personable by the time they reached their visitors. Celestia smiled at the two guards stationed at the entrance to the Doomslayer's camp. They had not spoken to her, or even moved since she and Luna had arrived. Consummate professionals, they stood perfectly straight, with eyes forward scanning for threats. Despite this, Celestia was certain the pair were very carefully noting every movement she and Luna made, with zealous attention to detail. The camp was massive, and made of leather tents set up in concentric circles, with paths breaking through the rings of tents at specific locations. However, based on what Celestia saw when she and Luna were flying over, only 5 of these paths actually led into the interior, and never directly. From above, Celestia thought it looked much like a labyrinth. Guards were stationed in pairs at each entrance, and at regular intervals along every path. They also patrolled the perimeter in groups of 4, their paths overlapping, so that no part of the outside was ever unguarded for even a second. Celestia also noted that every tent had a seal on it, that glowed with mystical energy of a type she had never even heard of. Likely either an alarm spell, or a trap to catch intruders. All in all, Celestia had never seen so well defended a location in all her life. "Sister, why aren't we here?" Luna asked, giving the 2 guards a nervous glance out of the corner of her eye. The Slayer of Doom made it quite clear that he hath no wish to speak further with thee. Celestia shook her head. Her sister was clearly trying to be the voice of reason. However, Celestia knew her sister well enough to recognize that, despite her objections, Luna could no more turn away from these creatures than she could. These beings were clearly suffering, and no matter how poor a decision it was to meddle, neither of the princesses could ever turn their back on a creature in need. "These beings are likely going to be here for the foreseeable future, sister. It would behoove us to do our best to try to be good neighbors, would it not?" Luna hesitated, but then nodded. "I suppose. However, we still feel it would be prudent to..." Luna never got the chance to finish, as the figure of the Doomslayer, and Michael Sanchez, came into view. Marching toward them, the Doomslayer somehow looked even more hostile than he had before. His eyes blazing beneath his helmet as he came to a stop in front of them. "You two are either the bravest horses I've ever met, or the dumbest. You're lucky I don't just have my men shoot you full of arrows," he snarled, his voice so filled with hate it was like a physical blow. "Now tell me what the fuck you want, so I can tell you to eat shit and die." Celestia simply smiled in the face of the Doomslayer's fury, as she offered him a basket of bread and fruit in a golden aura of energy. "We feel that perhaps we hath gotten off on the wrong hoof, prithee accept this as an offering of peace and welcome. We truly do wish that thou Celestia was cut off." As the Doomslayer snapped his hand out, smashing aside the basket and scattering its contents across the grass, giving Celestia a look of near psychotic fury, as he spoke. "Get the fuck out of here," he hissed, his eyes bulging with rage. Celestia, however, simply frowned, her eyes flashing, as she reached the end of her considerable rope. "Nay, we shalt not," Celestia declared angrily. "Not until thou explains thy purpose here, what thou art, and what in Equestria could possibly have happened to turn thou into such a foul-mouthed, hateful brute." The silence that followed that angry declaration was deafening. With Michael, Luna, and even the two seemingly immovable guards, staring in shock, as Celestia and the Doomslayer glared at each other. For a second, every creature present felt sure that Darren was going to wring Celestia's neck with his bare hands. However, a moment later he just scoffed. "I don't have time for this shit," he snarled as he turned away. "You want answers so bad, why don't you just read our minds or something if you're so fucking good with magic?" The Doomslayer spat, as he started walking back into the camp entrance. "Very well, if that is what thou wish, then we shall read thy mind," Celestia declared imperiously. "In fact, since thou art in such a hurry, we and our sister both shall read it." To the surprise of both Michael and the guards on duty, the Doomslayer stopped. "Oh really?" he said, his voice suddenly calm, and with a tone neither Michael nor Luna cared for. "Just like that, huh?" he asked, turning to look at Celestia as though intrigued. "Yes," Celestia replied without hesitation. "Just like that," she declared. The Doomslayer gave a nasty chuckle. "Okay then little horsey, if it'll shut you up and get you off my back, then let's do it. Gimme about a half hour to take care of a few things, and I'll let you have a look inside my noggin free of charge. Sound fair?" Celestia nodded, a little concerned that the Doomslayer was suddenly so agreeable, but unwilling to back down. "Very well, we shall meet thee here in 1/2 hour then," she declared, turning on her hoof and walking back toward Bridledown. Luna joining her after a last hesitant glance at the Doomslayer. Staring at his lord, Michael could hardly believe what had just happened. "My lord, why on Dua would you ever agree to this? Deliberately allowing your mind to be viewed by a spell? I do not understand." Suddenly the Doomslayer rounded on Michael, and for the first time, Michael actually felt genuinely unnerved by the look in his lord's eyes. There was nothing even remotely sane in the look the Doomslayer gave his lieutenant as he replied, his voice sounding disturbingly calm. "Well, that's why I'm in charge, isn't it? Because I understand perfectly," he declared, his voice sounding as smooth as oil being poured into a glass. While his eyes blazed with a frenzy of barely restrained insanity, as he turned and walked back into the camp. "Come along, brother, we have so much to do before our guests arrive." Hesitating for a moment, Michael looked at the two guards who had witnessed the exchange. Brother Malthus, and Brother Ogdiv each looked as unnerved as Michael felt. Exactly 1/2 hour later, the Doomslayer and 4 warriors chosen by him, stood staring at Celestia and Luna. Gathered behind the Doomslayer and his 4 volunteers, were nearly 200 members of the Legion. Their number included both Musashi, and Leonidas, as well as Michael Sanchez. All of whom were armed to the teeth, and all of whom were looking at their lord with varying degrees of concern. "So am I the only one who thinks this little stunt is a bad idea?" Musashi asked, as he glanced at his 2 fellow officers. "I agree, this is rather Unconventional, for him is it not? Are we certain he is in good health? Leonidas asked, hesitant to badmouth a superior officer, but unwilling to let his concerns go unvoiced. Michael shook his head. I am certain our Lord has an excellent reason for agreeing to this. He replied, more out of loyalty than conviction. As he recalled the unnerving look his Lord had had in his eyes earlier. Leonidas nodded, apparently willing to take Michael's word for it. Musashi, however, looked unconvinced, as the Doomslayer addressed the princesses. Okay, little horsies, time to put up or shut up, he declared, before gesturing over at the 4 men with him. Some of my brothers agreed to volunteer to allow you to read their minds at the same time as my own. You know, give you a bigger sample size. The Doomslayer declared, seeming to struggle not to laugh. Now, before we begin, there are a few ground rules I feel I should lay out. Celestia and Luna gave the Doomslayer a suspicious look as he continued. Oh, don't worry, the only real rule is, that if I drop dead, or if anything untoward happens while you two are inside my and my brother's heads, then the 200 gentlemen you see behind us, are under orders to kill you both. Here the Doomslayer seemed to stifle another laugh, and Michael visibly flinched as his brother started to give him questioning looks, as if asking why he didn't intervene. So, the Doomslayer concluded, his voice becoming a venomous hiss. Still want to go through with this? Celestia and Luna nodded, refusing to be cowed. Indeed, we agree to thy conditions, Luna declared. After hearing her reply, the Doomslayer reached up, undoing the straps of the helmet that obscured all but his eyes from view. Removing it and tossing it aside. The princesses let out an audible gasp at what was revealed. The Doomslayer's face was a ruin. His lips were gone, ripped away by the claws of some great beast, along with most of his cheek on the left side of his head, giving him a constant unholy grin. His nose was also mostly gone, little more than a disfigured lump of cartilage with 2 black holes leading into the depths of his skull. The hair atop his head was a gray stringy patchwork, most of it unable to grow back, due to his scalp being almost entirely covered in scar tissue. Every breath he took, whistled over blackened teeth that had been worn down to needle-like points. That looked less like teeth, than a mouth full of fangs. Only his eyes remained undamaged, burning in their sockets like a pair of glowing embers. You sure? He asked again, his voice echoing and hissing strangely without the helmet. Recovering from their momentary shock at the Doomslayer's revealed face, the princesses nodded, their expressions set and determined. Indeed, Celestia stated, her voice steady. The Doomslayer nodded. Have at it then, he declared, his voice distorted into an eerie whisper. Celestia and Luna nodded, as they began to cast the spell. Some might have asked Celestia and Luna why they were doing this? What about these creatures was so special, that helping them was worth risking their lives, and possibly their kingdom for? They owed nothing to these creatures, they knew nothing about them, and for Pony's sake their leader had tried to murder Celestia for no logically discernible reason. Most would have said that merely talking to these beasts, was already more concern than a pony of their station ought to show. However, any pony who would have asked that of Celestia or Luna, clearly didn't know them. Over 200 years ago, Celestia had volunteered herself as a sacrifice to raise the sun alone. Merely to spare one group of her fellow ponies from losing their magic. Many were those who begged her not to, including her friends and her parents. Let some pony else bear the burden, they said. Saving one group of ponies' magic one time wasn't going to change anything in the long run, they had cried. Let things stay the way they are, at least then no pony has to die, they had screamed. However, when Celestia had seen that group of unicorns, scared and crying, she realized she simply couldn't walk away. She knew it might only save them for that one day, but to her, saving them, even for just that one day, that was worth her life. That was just who she was. Then, several years later, her sister would have a similar revelation when she took custody of the moon and the realm of dreams. Helping those in need, against all odds, and even common sense, was ingrained into their very souls. So when these strange creatures came to them, In so much pain it was almost a visible force. The thing they wanted to know more than anything was, how can we help? The spell they were using was dangerous. One of the subjects was likely a homicidal maniac, and even if they learned something useful, there was no guarantee they could help. It was reckless, foolhardy, and not even their problem. And that was why they had to do it. As the energy of the spell reached its limit, connecting Luna and Celestia's minds to the 5 mysterious creatures before them, they braced themselves, and dove in. Michael watched events unfold, feeling more tense than he ever had in his life. 2 lines of blue and golden energy stretched out from the princess's glowing horns, before combining into a single beam that then split again into 5 new rays of silver. That struck the Doom Slayer and the volunteers in the center of their foreheads. As the princesses, the Doom Slayer, and his brothers, closed their eyes, Michael had to admit to being somewhat in awe. A spell like this on Dua would have been quite complex, and beyond all but the most skilled mages. Yet these 2 ponies were making it look as easy as breathing. Still, he was worried. He hadn't wanted to admit it to himself, but whatever was wrong with the Doom Slayer had been growing increasingly worse, since their arrival in this world. The Legion's leader had been growing more extreme and vicious for years. However, now it had become so bad it was like he was falling apart. So far Michael had hidden the worst of it from their brothers, but at this rate, it was only a matter of time before the truth got out. He did not know the reason his lord would consent to something like having his mind read, but Michael had a nasty suspicion it might be an attempt to provoke open conflict with the princesses. Why his lord would want such a thing was beyond him, but Michael feared that if it happened, it would rend the Legion asunder. They had all seen Unmaker fail to slay the pony named Celestia. Already Michael was hearing grumblings from his brothers, wondering why the Doom Slayer was ignoring the fact that even his own sword, a sacred artifact of the light, had judged these creatures as not being a threat. Then again, perhaps Michael was not giving his lord enough credit. After all, for 30 years and more he had led them successfully through literal hell. He was the strongest in the Legion, and had personally slain all but 3 of the monstrous leaders of hell. The Doom Slayer was the mightiest, and most capable man Michael had ever known. He had taught Michael everything he knew and more. Who was he to question the judgment of such a man? However, Michael's ability to lie to himself was shattered when he heard the princesses scream in pain. Words were one of the mightiest tools in a princess's arsenal. With the right words it was possible to bring smiles to the faces of the miserable, rally the wicked to a righteous cause, or even stop a war dead. Words had power far greater than most would admit, and it behooved every leader worth her salt to familiarize themselves with as many as possible. However, on seeing the devastation that had befallen the Doom Slayer and his people, words failed both Luna and Celestia, utterly. What had been done to the people of Janua was beyond any definition of evil they could imagine. It was a cruelty that flew in the face of all sense and reason, obliterating Celestia and Luna's very understanding of the limits of horror. Billions dead, mares, stallions, and foals of the Doom Slayer species, trampled to dust amid the roars of monsters. A world, vibrant, and filled with life and promise, destroyed in an instant by a single act of selfishness. Stallions and mares who once laughed with their families, forced to fight and kill or die, day after everlasting day. Stallions who broke under the strain put down by their fellows. Families allowed to be consumed because it was impossible to both protect them and survive. Luna, desperate to stop the horror, attempted to banish the monstrosities she saw before her, to strike them down like the vile nightmares they were. However, this availed her nothing. As this was not, and had never been, a dream. Celestia fared no better, futilely throwing up shields and conjuring blasts of energy, desperate to do anything to help. However, there was no helping, not now. These events were long in the past, only the memories remained. Finally Luna screamed, feeling despair overtake her at her own helplessness. "Sister," she cried out, tears in her eyes as she saw more innocents die in screaming agony. "Please! We need to help them." Celestia struggled to think through her own horror and tears, as the sounds of the carnage echoed in her ears. What had been done to these stallions was abominable, no creature deserved this, or had a right to inflict it. There had to be a way, some way they could help, even if only a little. Frantically struggling to do the impossible, Celestia began to lose herself in the unending insanity of it all, as the world went black around her. Celestia felt herself drifting in a void of despair, crying out to the nothingness around her with tears in her eyes, to do what it wanted with her, but to let these creatures have back their lives. However, predictably, there was no answer, as Celestia drifted ever deeper into the abyss of sorrow and madness. Then, she felt it, a new emotion, one she had experienced only a few times before. Clinging to it, she felt the darkness around her recoil. Almost instinctively, she clutched at that tiny ember of emotion. A single spark, that she now began to feed. The spark flickered, then burned, then blazed, then roared. And Celestia roared with it. Rage, not the rage of the Doom Slayer, but a purer, mightier rage. The rage of a mother whose child has been hurt. The rage of a queen whose subjects are being attacked. The rage of a soldier whose country is being bombed. A wrath that comes only when true injustice stands before those beloved of kindness and peace. Celestia burned with it, like a newborn sun, and the darkness around her was charred away, like paper thrown upon a bonfire. As the void of despair evaporated, she could feel that Luna was once more at her side, and that she too felt this overpowering sense of righteous indignation. How dare the king of Keemd barter the lives of these creatures' families and friends for power? How dare the demons attack their world and slaughter their families? How dare the universe be so callous as to allow any of this? As one, the princesses roared out to all creation. Feeling an energy of inconceivable power building within them with every word. We are the princesses of Equestria. And by our word, this shall not stand. The last thing they heard before being enveloped in a nova of light and sound, was a pair of voices, far off in the distance. One was roaring something indecipherable, sounding as twisted as it did cruel. The vile voice was deep and booming, almost managing to cover up the second voice. In a tone warped by absolute misery, the second voice sobbed out incoherent apologies, though neither princess could determine to whom the apologies were meant. Yet, as the energy spawned from their wrath and given direction through a force they could never have described engulfed their senses, the princesses heard a name. It was not spoken, yet it appeared in the princesses' minds clear as day. Never once had they heard this name before, nor any other like it, yet despite that, they felt sure of it being vitally important. The key to saving both the Legion, and its broken master. The name was Darren Grandel. Michael slowly got to his feet, trying to understand what just happened. He recalled hearing the princesses scream, and immediately rushed over to see what had gone wrong. The spell had seemed to still be functioning, but the princesses had fallen to the ground. Thrashing and screaming, they remained connected to the Doom Slayer and the 4 volunteers by the strange tethers of energy emitted by their horns. Michael had immediately sent for Commander Common and Lieutenant Magnus. However, despite their best efforts, they had been unable to end the spell. At one point, out of sheer desperation, Michael had ordered Musashi to try to cut the energy tether with his Hellbane. However, to their horror, the blade simply passed right through the beam as if it wasn't even there. It was then, that the princesses had suddenly stopped screaming. Levitating into the air, they had each begun to glow brighter and brighter, and Michael noticed the Doomslayer's face twisting in discomfort. Leonidas had noticed it too, and several of the Legion had aimed arrows at the princesses. But Michael shouted at them to stand down, declaring that they should wait and see what happened. The glow had eventually grown so bright that none in the Legion could bear to look at the princesses any longer, covering their eyes with their hands, as the light even pierced through closed eyelids. Then, as they stood there blinded, the Legion heard the voices of the princesses speaking in perfect unison. The sound booming like thunder across a mountain range as they said the words. We are the princesses of Equestria. And by our word, this shall not stand. Immediately after, a feeling like nothing Michael had ever experienced flowed over him, bringing him to his knees. It was impossible to describe, It was like every good feeling he had ever experienced all wrapped into one. His mother's loving embrace, the warmth of a fire on a cold day, a kitten's purr, a child's laughter. The sensation filled his every pore, his every cell, his every atom. All that was Michael Melicon Sanchez was saturated in this indescribable feeling. Then, without explanation or preamble, the sensation vanished. As Michael rose to his feet, he realized he felt different, he felt lighter. Stronger. Faster. He felt amazing, better than he had in decades in fact. Opening his eyes, he started to ask if everyone was all right, only for the words to freeze in his mouth. Everyone was far more than merely all right. Before Michael were his brothers, hale and hearty, not one of whom looked a day over 20. "Brother Musashi?" Michael asked the young man across from him, wanting to be sure he wasn't hallucinating. Musashi nodded, stunned beyond words. "Holy shit! Is this for real?" Musashi asked, his voice barely a whisper, as he stared at his body in awe. "If it is not brother, then I fear we all truly have died," came the once more youthful voice of Leonidas. "But how?" demanded the almost childlike voice of a 20-year-old Kamen. "Such magic! It is beyond anything mortals could ever accomplish. Even the mage lords at the height of their power could only have dreamed of something like this. Look! Every scar and injury is gone. It even restored the limbs of those brothers who had lost them." It was then, that a weak, but good-natured laugh, was heard off to the side, and all eyes turned to look at the two prostrate princesses. Thank the stars! It worked! Luna croaked happily, before fainting. As Celestia managed to give a small smile. "Now! Thou have thine lives to live over again," she breathed out, clearly spent. "But why?" Michael asked, flabbergasted at the enormity of such a miracle. Celestia just gave another smile. "Because? What happened to thee was unfair." Celestia trailed off, as she too slipped into unconsciousness. "Unfair?" Michael felt tears in his eyes as he repeated Celestia's words. His voice a shaking whisper, as his body became paralyzed with emotion. "They gave us our lives again, simply because it was fair?" At that moment, Musashi stepped forward, hurriedly brushing tears from his eyes as he roared at the top of his lungs. "Medic! Get me a goddamn medic over here now!" Frantically, the Legion scrambled to comply, desperate to assist their unconscious saviors. Until a voice as cold as the void itself, spoke, its tone as uncaring as stone. "What do you all think you're doing?" The Legion froze, as it regarded the renewed form of its leader. His noble-featured face devoid of any trace of scarring, and his head once more covered by thick black hair, done into a crew cut. His two red eyes all but glowing. Musashi wasted no time in explaining. "The princesses collapsed, boss. We need to." The Doomslayer cut him off with a look as cold as his words. "And how is that our problem?" he asked. Musashi looked at him in stark disbelief. "Boss? They? Look what they did for us," he replied, unable to comprehend how his leader was unmoved by this. The Doomslayer made a dismissive gesture. "What of it? If this is a gift, then we don't owe them shit, and if it's a bribe then I refuse to give them shit. Either way, we have more important things to do than help idiots out of messes they put themselves in." The look Musashi gave the Doomslayer changed, from disbelieving, to something halfway between horror and abject fury. Moving up to his leader, Musashi glared into his eyes, while simultaneously placing his hand on the handle of justice. He spoke in a voice that, though outwardly calm, trembled with barely suppressed rage. "Are you telling me, boss, that you are ordering us not to help the creatures who just performed a fucking miracle on our behalf?" The Doomslayer, his eyes devoid of even a hint of compassion, opened his mouth to reply, but was interrupted by Michael, who for the first time, found himself having to manage his own temper in regards to his leader. "My lord, you are correct that a gift by definition does not require reciprocation. However, there is also no obligation not to reciprocate. Surely no harm lies in letting those who wish to offer aid do so. For a moment Michael feared his argument had fallen upon deaf ears. If it had, and judging from the disbelieving and outraged glares being shot at his lord, there would likely be blood. However, and to the relief of all, the Doomslayer simply turned on his heel, and headed back to camp. His reply as stinging and hateful as if he was addressing an enemy. Do what you want. Just don't ever forget who your commanding officer is. Musashi's grip tightened on the handle of his sword, as the legion moved swiftly around him to tend to the fallen princesses. Oh, I won't forget, boss. Musashi growled through gritted teeth, as he turned to oversee his brothers administering aid. Count on it.